Hi. So in today's lecture, we're going to be looking at things you've probably been already feeling and hearing, um, but digging into what that really means and where that's all come from. By now, you've read the Michael Apple article on audit culture, or you're about to read the Michael Apple on audit culture. It's not easy, but this will help give you some more context to it and make it more understandable. So what we're going to be going over here is the, the idea of audit culture in itself, the history of how we got here, and then with those things in mind, knowing what you know about data and how to use it well, how would you encourage a school to be data informed? All right, so audit culture. You've probably heard of audits, okay? An audit is an official inspection of someone or some organization's accounts, okay? Usually by somebody outside of the family or outside of the organization, right? So the idea of an audit, really, you've heard about financial audits, I'm sure, is to make sure that all of the money is going where it's supposed to go and that the organization is doing what it's supposed to do. So an educational audit is the idea of making sure that everything in the school, all the different systems of the school, all the different resources of the school, all the different policies and practices of the school are getting us where we want to go, okay, in terms of students learning well, okay. But we can all feel what's going on in a culture like that, right? It's somebody trying to control from a distance what it is we're doing, right? We feel it in the forms of standardized tests that say that they're measuring um, kids' learning. But really what happens from those standardized tests, of course, is that the results of that, just the data, are read by folks outside our school, and from that they come up with um, assumptions about what's going on in the school and trying to really control what's going on in that school. Okay, this leads to, I'm sure you've heard the phrase data-driven instruction a lot. Well, one of the things about this course is really working hard for a new generation of leaders, and that's you, a new generation of teachers and leaders, to be data informed, not data driven. Cows and cattle are driven, right? They don't think. They're just pushed in a certain direction. But you need to be informed by the data, and you want your colleagues to be informed by the data so that you can make good decisions, right? So that's really different from having your conduct controlled by outside, as this sort of audit culture, which Michael Apple dove into even more, demonstrates to you. But people can feel it. They can feel that sense of being controlled by outside, and it's you can sense it in the resentment that parents put together on these standardized tests, the resentment that teachers feel about it, and so forth. They're not resenting the test itself. What they're resenting is the elements of control that come with that. So where did this come from, right? There's kind of a long history of it, and we're going to dive into it a bit here, okay? All the way back in 1983, we started with a report called A Nation at Risk, and we've moved up to today with a variety of federal laws and acts. Now, the report, A Nation at Risk, was where you may have heard the phrase, a rising tide of mediocrity, right? The idea that schools were just kind of mediocre, and that was becoming the dominant way of seeing schools. That was a federally done report. The person who authored that report eventually became Secretary of Education. When President George W. Bush got to the presidency, he started with No Child Left Behind, which he got federal approval for. And what we saw in No Child Left Behind was the introduction of a couple of really important things. One, although we had already been taking tests, standardized tests, this was the first time schools were required to break that data apart, to disaggregate that data in terms of the race of the students, their social class, gender, language status, if they were English language learners, disability. Okay, really, really important. And in this case, the schools were being evaluated. Now, schools that didn't measure up after several years, if they didn't make their growth targets that came out of the audit of the scores, then parents were empowered to leave that school. They could go to another school in the district if the school that they were going to wasn't measuring up. So it punished schools for their results. Okay. When President Obama came into the office, they took that to another level. Okay. They kept the disaggregated data, so we still had to break apart our results by race, class, gender, language status, disability. And by the way, what's really important there is that if students in any one of those categories, in any particular race, gender, or disability status, if kids there were not measuring up, if they were not getting the scores that were expected on the tests, then the school was accountable for that, and that was a real problem. But the big deal here is that schools couldn't just say, oh yeah, you know, everybody's doing fine. Well, they had to prove it with this disaggregated data. Okay. Now, what changed between No Child Left Behind and then 8 years later, Race to the Top, was that schools were not just evaluated by the student data, but now teachers and principals also were evaluated based on the scores of their kids. And that became part of the plan that schools had to put together in order to get federal money. So Race to the Top didn't punish schools the way that No Child Left Behind did. It didn't say that kids had to leave or families could leave, rather, if the scores weren't measuring up. It offered incentives in terms of money, and the schools were supported with those financial incentives. But in order to get the money, they had to agree that that teachers and principals would now also be held accountable to the same data. Now, in 2016, the Every Student Succeeds Act passed, and we still had the disaggregated data. There was somewhat more flexibility offered to schools and states and districts about how they would hold people accountable to that. It wasn't entirely clear how that was going to work out. And then there were other indicators added besides just English language arts and math and other academic scores that were going to be added to that. But everything changed, of course, with the election of Donald Trump and Secretary DeVos coming. And we now have what's being proposed. It hasn't passed anywhere yet, but we now have the Educational Choice Act. This is going to send, what's proposed anyways, it hasn't changed yet. I mean, it hasn't passed yet. It will send accountability back to the states. It's not really clear who's going to be monitoring that. The U.S. Department of Ed will only be giving block grants to the schools. It will guarantee vouchers, and it also actually eliminates the school lunch provisions. Now, the reason I mentioned the vouchers piece here is that if you look all the way back to No Child Left Behind, not passing the tests, if the school failed those tests, right, then parents were allowed to leave. They were allowed to take their kids to another school in the district. What the Educational Choice Act does is it takes that and bumps it up a whole other level to where parents now, if that law passes, that's a big if now, but the failure of the school to pass the tests could be used as an argument for giving parents the vouchers they want in terms of a check essentially from the district to take to any school they want, not just another school in the district, but to a charter school or a private school or wherever. So you can see the seeds of that were planted all the way back in 2001 with No Child Left Behind. Now, to a lot of folks, this whole testing thing has seemed like sort of common sense, right? That the testing should be able to tell us what's going on in the classroom, and that's a lot of the logic that you hear in politics and in the public around what's going on with schools. But Kevin Kumashiro, who you see pictured here, wrote a book called Bad Teachers, how blaming teachers distorts the bigger picture of what's going on in schools. And he says this about what's supposed to be common sense. He says, the common sense about schools and teachers today doesn't call on Americans to see the broader picture, to see a broader system of education. Rather, common sense narrows our vision to the level of the individual. Good teachers make for good schools, and since we repeatedly hear that our schools are bad, so must be our teachers, at least some of them, right? So this is the logic, in the common sense in which teachers are really getting beat up on by this notion of testing that sort of proves that our schools are poor. And that goes all the way back to, as I mentioned to you, A Nation at Risk back in the 80s and moving on up through this federal legislation. All right. So we're going to use a little bit of this lecture to introduce your task for this week. Okay. You've gotten to be a whole lot smarter about what data actually does say and what it doesn't say in these tests, right? So your principal is asking you for some help. You'll see in this week's documents that there is a printout of the ELA results for a middle school here in New Jersey. And your principal has asked you for help, and you're giving her some help on what she can do with those results for the school. So you're going to help advise her on these 5 questions. What's important in this report? What should folks in the school know, especially your teachers in that school? What should people know? Okay. But as you know, those results are kind of limited. So you're going to help your principal figure out what other questions should people be asking once they see this data. Okay. She, again, has turned to you because you're getting to be so smart and is asking you, what are the first 5 steps that we should take with this report? What should we be doing? So you're going to give her an outline of that. And now, here's where I want you to really think back to all the work we've been doing about how teachers and educators and so forth should be talking about data. What's the evidence that you're developing a data-informed school? Okay, that people are actually getting to be better at their teaching because of what they've done with this ELA report. Not just getting beaten into submission, not just getting told, oh, you're doing a terrible job, or teachers really need to do this, that, and the other, okay? How would you know if you walked into any of those team meetings, any PLC meeting and so forth, and you heard people dealing with this ELA report, what would be the evidence to you and to your principal that you guys are doing that really well? So that's the setup for this week's exercise in helping you understand what's going on with audit culture and how in the history of education we want to make, or history of education assessment, we want to make sure that we're getting to be data informed, not just data driven. Thank you very much.